This is Math 2, 5.3 notes. That's Unit 5, Lesson 3. The title for this lesson is Properties of Rhombuses. What I do want to point out is that all three of these, the rhombus, the rectangle, and the square, all three of them are parallelograms. So we'll put that little note here. All are parallelograms. Which means all the properties that we had in our previous lesson about parallelograms will hold true for this lesson as well. So, all of this stuff, opposite sides are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, diagonals bisect each other, and even this extra one here. All of this is still true for a rhombus, a rectangle, and a square, because these are all parallelograms. Okay. A rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. With 4 congruent sides. Okay, so properties. One of them that you will need to know is that the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. That is something you will need to flat out remember for any upcoming worksheets, quizzes, or test. So let's draw a picture. Congruent, congruent, congruent. Now on a regular parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent. On a rhombus, all 4 sides are congruent. And we know before that diagonals bisect each other, but in a rhombus, diagonals are also perpendicular to each other. So they will ask you questions on a quiz or a test or even a worksheet. What's the measure of an angle 1? Without any work, it's 90 degrees. If this were angle 2, it would be 90 degrees. 90 degrees, 90 degrees. All 4 of these little angles inside are right angles. All right, next one. Property you will need to know is that diagonals bisect the angles. And just a really quick side note, a square is a rhombus. A square is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. There's an extra special piece to it, but a square is a rhombus. Not all rhombuses are squares, but all squares are rhombuses. All right, we will talk more about that in class as well. So we're going to draw another rhombus with 4 congruent sides. And both of these properties here deal with their diagonals. So the first one was that the diagonals were perpendicular. This one is that diagonals bisect the angles. So this doesn't happen in all parallelograms, but only parallelograms that are a rhombus. So this angle is congruent and that angle is congruent. Now remember, opposite angles are equal, opposite angles are congruent. So if you take 2 equal angles and cut them both in half, they're all equal to each other. So 1, 2, 3, 4, those 4 little angles are congruent to each other. The same is true about these opposite angles. These big opposite angles are congruent, and if you cut 2 congruent angles in half, they're all congruent to each other. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, those 2 are congruent to these 2, and those 2 are congruent to those 2. Not all the way around, but just opposite. That set and that set. Okay, we are going to move on to a rectangle. A rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. So a rectangle doesn't necessarily have 4 congruent sides like a rhombus, but it does have 4 right angles. So we're going to put here one of the properties you will need to definitely know is that the diagonals are congruent. And again, this one has to do with its diagonals, as these other two did as well. Okay, so let's draw a rectangle. A rectangle is a parallelogram. Opposite sides are equal, opposite sides are parallel, opposite angles are congruent, as well as consecutive angles are supplementary. 90 plus 90 is 180. This one is also 90. 90 plus 90 is 180. And same down here, 90 plus 90 is 180, and it works all the way around. Okay, so what happens is diagonals here, say, is this is not a rhombus. A rectangle can be a rhombus, and a rhombus can be a rectangle. That makes a special shape, but not all rectangles are rhombuses, meaning not all sides are congruent. So a mistake kids make is they'll say, oh, this is 90 cut in half, so each of these little angles is 45. That is not true. These little angles here, the 90-degree angles, are not bisected. These angles are not bisected by the diagonals, because that's only for a rhombus, and this is a rectangle. So please, when I'm asking you for these little angles, and I will, do not say this. Kids often say, oh, it's 45 and 45 because together that makes 90. No. That's for a square, yes, but not for a rectangle. All right, so if there's anything you take away from a rectangle, it should be that we know diagonals bisect each other, but they're actually equal as well. So if you take two equal segments and cut them in half, you will have equal, 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 and equal. 1, 2, 3, 4. All the way around. If you remember from the previous lesson, only two sets were congruent. Those two sets and that set. Those two were congruent to each other. Those two were congruent to each other. This one, all of them are congruent. So if you take anything away, let it be that there are 4 isosceles triangles. Two sets. These two are congruent. They're isosceles triangles. Those two are congruent. They are isosceles triangles. But can you see that? Congruent sides, meaning that these base angles are congruent. Congruent sides, which means those two little base angles are congruent. You will need to know that. All right, our last shape is the square. And the square is pretty much a rhombus and a rectangle put together. There are 4 congruent sides, and it is a parallelogram. There's 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So all of these have the properties of a parallelogram, and the square has all of the properties of a parallelogram plus the rhombus plus the rectangle all put together. So I'm just going to list it all. It has diagonals are perpendicular to each other. Diagonals bisect the angles. That's that one right there. And diagonals are congruent. So it has all of the properties, which makes sense because a square is a rhombus because it has 4 congruent sides, and it is also a rectangle because it has 4 right angles. All right. We are going to draw a picture, but we're going to do the problem, a little quick example with this picture. So I'm just going to put a little bubble here. Example. And let's draw our square. All right, so A, B, C, D, and I'm telling you this is a square. And I'm going to draw my diagonals across this way. I'm going to call this angle 1, angle 2, and angle 3. All right. Angle 1 equals, angle 2 equals, angle 3 equals. Now look where where I always go first if it's a square, which is a rhombus. If I'm dealing with a rhombus, if I'm ever dealing with the rhombus, which a square is, I go straight to the inside and see if that's an angle they're asking for, and they are. Remember what I said earlier, all of these are right angles. That's 90, that is 90. Those are vertical angles, so angle 3 is also 90. Okay, I'm going to take that picture and I'm going to redraw it here just so we can see it a little better. There's B, there's C, and this is the 90 degrees. Do you see? I just tilted it over so it's a little easier to see. Now when you're looking at it this way, we're looking for angles 1 and 2. Now taking a look, because a square is a rectangle, diagonals are diagonals are congruent, which, remember, that means that we have a bunch of little isosceles triangles. So that is an isosceles triangle, which means those two are the base angles. So if we call that one X, that one there can also be called X because it is an isosceles triangle. X plus 90 equals 180. 2x plus 90 equals 180. Subtract the 90. 2x equals 90. Divide both sides by 2. X equals 45 degrees. So angle 1 and angle 2 are both 45 degrees. So remember what I said earlier, this rectangle does not get cut in half where it's 45 and 45. A square does every single time. When you draw the diagonals, it's 45 and 45 in all the little corners. A square, yes. A rectangle, no. All right, that is it for this lesson. We'll talk more about this in class.